keeping up with the Ukraine situation, it feels incredibly complex, right? So much happening, so much at stake.
Absolutely. It's a constant challenge to stay fully informed.
Which is why today we're doing a deep dive. We're looking at some pretty significant media reports suggesting a possible shift, a big one, in the U.S. position on Crimea.
And tied to that, a potential peace framework for Ukraine that's being floated.
Exactly. So for anyone following global events closely, and maybe especially for UPSC aspirants tracking current affairs, these reports are crucial. We've seen them mentioned in places like the Eurasian Times.
Right. So our goal here, our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack these reports. What's in this proposed framework? Why might the U.S. be considering recognizing Crimea as Russian?
Especially when you compare it to, the other occupied territories in Ukraine, it raises questions.
Definitely. It can feel overwhelming trying to piece it all together.
But hopefully we can bring some clarity, some context to it all. Okay, so let's start right there. This reported U.S. peace proposal. What are the core pieces, the sort of nuts and bolts?
Okay, so based on the reports, there are a few key components. First, and this is the big one, U.S. recognition of Crimea as actually being Russian territory.
Wow, okay. Formal recognition.
Formal recognition. Second, maybe a freeze on the current front lines, basically locking things in place as they are now, which would mean Russia keeps significant territory gains since 2022.
Right, that's a major point.
Then there are assurances reportedly being offered to Russia that Ukraine won't join NATO. That's always been a huge sticking point for Moscow.
A key Russian demand, yeah.
And finally, the reports mention the possibility down the line of lifting sanctions against Russia, contingent, of course, on the deal holding.
Okay, so that sounds like quite a bit potentially going Russia's way. What's reportedly in it for Ukraine? Because it seems, on the surface, quite tilted.
That's exactly the point, and why there's reported skepticism from Kyiv. The benefits suggested for Ukraine are things like they get to keep their army,
Okay.
maybe regain some territory. Specifically mentioned is the Kherson region. Potential security guarantees are also mentioned, but the details seem a bit, vague in the reporting.
Guarantees are always tricky.
And also commitment for ongoing financial aid, for rebuilding.
So security, money, maybe a bit of land back. But compared to recognizing Crimea and freezing lines elsewhere, I can see the skepticism. Didn't President Zelensky recently push back hard on the Crimea point?
Yes, he did. Back on April 22nd, he made it very clear. He stated Ukraine would not recognize Crimea as Russian territory, citing the Ukrainian constitution.
So a fundamental block right there from Ukraine's side.
It highlights the huge challenge that this kind of proposal faces, especially that perceived imbalance in what each side gains tangibly.
Okay, let's dig into this potential U.S. recognition of Crimea. It feels like a massive U-turn from 2014. I mean, the U.S. reaction back then was unequivocal, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Unequivocal is the right word. After Russia's annexation in 2014, the U.S. strongly condemned it, called it illegal, a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, a breach of international law.
They backed that UN resolution too, right?
They did. The U.S. was a key supporter of UN General Assembly Resolution 68262. That resolution specifically condemned the annexation, affirmed Ukraine's borders, including Crimea.
And sanctions followed.
Yes, the Obama administration rolled out significant sanctions, targeted individuals, companies, whole sectors of the Russian economy. Russia was even kicked out of the G8, which became the G7. So, yeah, comparing that to these recent reports, it's a significant potential shift.
So how did we get from that firm stance to this point? It wasn't overnight, surely. What's the evolution been like?
No, definitely not overnight. It's been more of a gradual drift, with various signals popping up over the years. You could even go back to June 2018.
Under Trump's first term.
Right. President Trump publicly suggested, for the first time really, that the U.S. might consider recognizing Crimea as Russian. He said it was up for discussion before his meeting with Putin.
I remember that. And didn't he also reportedly say something at a G7 meeting about the Russian speakers there?
He did, reportedly suggesting Crimea should belong to Russia, because most people there speak Russian. So the idea wasn't entirely new even then.
And it wasn't just politicians stirring the pot, was it? Elon Musk weighed in quite publicly, too.
He certainly did. In October 2022, he put out that Twitter poll suggesting Ukraine should just cede Crimea to Russia.
Citing history and demographics, I think.
Exactly. History back to 1783, the language situation. Then later, in September 2023, he confirmed he'd refused to activate Starlink over Crimea the year before.
Right, to avoid escalation.
Yes, and in explaining that, he explicitly made a distinction between Crimea and Donbass. It's sort of implied he saw Crimea differently.
That's an interesting subtext. And this thinking wasn't just external commentary, right? There were whispers from within the U.S. military establishment, too.
That's correct. Reports started surfacing, maybe early 2023, about Pentagon briefings, classified ones, suggesting that Ukraine regaining Crimea by force was, well, unlikely, a long shot militarily.
So a dose of military realism creeping in.
That assessment likely played a role in shaping this potential new framework. And then, much more recently, February 2025, you had Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth.
Under the second Trump administration, hypothetically.
Right. Under that scenario, Hegseth signaled a pretty clear shift. He said Ukraine needed to drop the illusionary goal of getting back to pre-2014 borders, specifically mentioning 2014, the year Crimea was taken. He talked about needing a realistic assessment of the battlefield.
Okay, that's quite direct. So the picture emerging is the U.S. potentially drawing a line. Crimea might be treated differently from other Russian-occupied areas in the southeast, only Crimea considered for formal recognition.
That seems to be the distinction suggested in these reports.
So what's the logic? Why single out Crimea? This must tie into Russia's own justifications.
Exactly. This is where Russia's specific historical claims on Crimea come into play. They argue these claims are, let's say, deeper or different than for other parts of Ukraine they occupy.
Okay, walk us through that history briefly.
Well, you have early influence from Kievan Rus, then Mongol rule, the Crimean Khanate linked to the Ottomans. But the big turning point for Russia's narrative is 1783.
Catherine the Great.
Precisely. Catherine the Great annexes Crimea into the Russian Empire after wars with the Ottomans. It then stays part of the Russian Empire, and later, within the Soviet Union, it's part of the Russian Republic, the RSFSR.
Until 1954, the famous transfer to Ukraine. How does Russia frame that?
They often portray it as just an administrative shuffle within one country, the USSR, not fundamentally changing who it belonged to. The official reason given back then was symbolic, celebrating the reunification of Ukraine with Russia.
A gesture of friendship, supposedly.
Supposedly. Though historians also point to internal Soviet politics, maybe power struggles involving Khrushchev and Malenkov playing a role, and crucially, at that time, Crimea already has a large ethnic Russian population.
Right, the demographics. That's another pillar for Russia's argument.
It is. Historically and currently, Crimea has a majority Russian-speaking population. The last reliable census, the Ukrainian one from 2001, showed about 77% identified Russian as their native language.
Though we should acknowledge that's partly due to historical Russification policies.
Absolutely. That context is important. Policies under the czars definitely shaped the demographics. But Russia points to the current linguistic reality as a key factor today.
And then there's the strategic angle, the Black Sea Fleet. That's huge.
Immense. Crimea has been the main base for the Russian Black Sea Fleet since, again, 1783. Even after Ukraine became independent, Russia kept its base in Sevastopol through agreements.
So deep military roots there.
Deep historical ties and undeniable strategic value. Controlling that peninsula is vital for Russia's naval power in the Black Sea, access to the Mediterranean. It's a cornerstone of their strategic posture.
And finally, the 2014 referendum. Contentious, but Russia uses it.
They do. After the Maidan Revolution in Kyiv, Russia moved in, organized that quick referendum. The reported result was overwhelming, like 97% voting to join Russia.
But internationally rejected, mostly.
Overwhelmingly rejected by Ukraine and most countries as illegal, violating international law conducted under occupation, essentially. But Russia holds it up as the democratic will of the Crimean people.
So, summing up Russia's case, long history, Russian-speaking majority, vital naval base, and that referendum result. What's Ukraine's counter? How do they refute all that?
Ukraine pushes back strongly on all fronts. They highlight their own historical ties back to Kievan Rus, arguing they're an equal successor state. They stress the 1954 transfer was legally binding and final.
And didn't Russia itself recognize Ukraine's borders after the Soviet Union collapsed?
Crucially, yes. In 1991, Russia, along with other newly independent states, recognized existing borders. Ukraine argues this included Crimea, and they maintain the 2014 referendum was completely illegitimate, a sham under duress.
And it seems despite any potential U.S. policy shift, Ukraine isn't backing down on its claim.
That's certainly the message. President Zelensky has admitted retaking Crimea militarily right now is very difficult, perhaps impossible. But he insists they'll pursue its return through diplomacy, through political means.
So even if the U.S. were to change its stance, Ukraine's claim remains firm.
That's the expectation, yes. They'd likely continue diplomatic efforts and maintain their legal claim.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. We're seeing reports of a potential U.S. peace proposal. pivoting on recognizing Crimea as Russian. This marks a potential major shift from the strong condemnation back in 2014.
And Russia's justification rests on history, demographics, the strategic fleet, and that disputed 2014 referendum.
While Ukraine stands firm on its territorial integrity, the 1954 transfers finality, and the illegality of the annexation.
Exactly. It's a situation that's clearly still developing, very fluid, with massive implications for international law, for geopolitics, and obviously for the future of Ukraine itself.
It really leaves you with a lot to process. Considering all this historical complexity, the current military situation, what are the long-term consequences if territorial gains made by force start getting legitimized, even if there are historical or demographic arguments attached?
That's the profoundly difficult question, isn't it? Where does that lead in terms of international order? There are no easy answers.
No easy answers at all. And for you listening, especially if you're a UPSC aspirant, digging into these layers, the history, the shifting politics, the legal arguments, it's absolutely vital for understanding current global events. These aren't just headlines, they have deep roots.
We really hope this deep dive helped provide some structure to it all. Definitely like, subscribe if you found this useful, and please do leave a comment if you have more questions or other related topics you'd like us to explore. Let us know.
And just to reiterate, particularly for reference, the basis for our discussion today comes from media reports, including those published in the Eurasian Times. Thanks for tuning in.